The year was 1605, and London simmered with unease. The bells of St. Paul's tolled across a city thick with woe and suspicion. Its narrow lanes crammed with merchants and beggars, priests and spies. England was a land still raw from religious wars, where whispers of Catholic rebellion coiled like smoke beneath the surface of everyday life. And in the cold darkness beneath the Palace of Westminster, a soldier crouched among barrels of powder, waiting for dawn. His name was Guy Fawkes. To the common imagination centuries later, he would become a mask, a caricature, the grinning effigy thrown upon bonfires every November 5th. But in that moment, in the bowels of Parliament, he was flesh and blood, a man prepared to ignite one of the most devastating acts of treason in history. Fawkes was not a nobleman, not a scheming courtier in silken doublet. He was a soldier. Born in York in 1570 to a Protestant father and a Catholic mother, he had watched England's persecution of Catholics harden into cruelty. Priests hunted, families fined, worship forced underground. By the time he came of age, Guy's faith had fused with fire. He traveled to Flanders and joined the Spanish army, fighting for Catholic monarchs against Protestant rebels. There he earned a reputation for courage, discipline, and a soldier's cold pragmatism. He was no reckless zealot, he was a professional. When he returned to England, he slipped into the orbit of Robert Catesby, the passionate Catholic gentleman who had conceived the audacious gunpowder plot. The plan was simple in outline, impossible in scale: to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, killing King James I, his heir, his ministers, and the assembled nobility in a single fiery stroke. From the ashes, they would ignite a Catholic uprising and place James's young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, on the throne as a Catholic queen. It was madness, and yet, to the conspirators, it was salvation. Catesby and his circle needed someone with military discipline, someone who could secure powder, handle explosives, and if necessary, die with steady hands. Guy Fawkes was their man. His foreign service made him an outsider, his iron will made him trustworthy, and his faith made him dangerous. In their eyes, he was perfect. By autumn of 1605, the conspirators had stockpiled 36 barrels of gunpowder in a vault beneath the House of Lords, enough to shatter the Palace of Westminster into rubble, enough to send James and his court flying in flames across the Thames. Fawkes was chosen as the guardian of the powder, the man who would strike the spark. But in a scheme woven of secrecy and desperation, betrayal is always close. In late October, an anonymous letter was delivered to Lord Monteagle, warning him to stay away from Parliament on November 5th. Historians still debate whether the letter was a genuine attempt to save a Catholic sympathizer or a calculated trap. Whatever its origin, it set the machinery of discovery in motion. The night of November 4th, soldiers searched the undercrofts of Westminster. At first, they found nothing, but in the early hours of November 5th, they returned with torches. In one chamber, stacked innocuously among firewood and coal, they found barrels, and standing guard over them was a tall man cloaked and armed with slow matches. Guy Fawkes, dragged before Sir Thomas Knivet, he gave his name as John Johnson, servant to a gentleman. But his poise betrayed him. When asked why he stood watch with such a store of powder, he answered coldly that his intention was to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. It was defiance, not denial. By dawn, the news had spread through London like wildfire. The king's enemies had planned to annihilate him and his court in an explosion that would have reshaped England. And though the plot had failed, the capture of Fawkes was more than a triumph of security. It was an opportunity for theater. For in the eyes of King James and his ministers, Guy Fawkes was not merely a soldier. He was the embodiment of Catholic treachery, the face of a conspiracy that threatened the crown, the church, and the very order of England. His fate would not be a swift execution. No, it would be a spectacle. The people would not merely hear that a traitor had been caught. They would see him broken. They would hear his screams. They would smell the acrid smoke of his burning entrails. His body would be carved apart, scattered to the four winds, so that no trace of his defiance could remain. But in that first moment of discovery, in the flicker of torchlight on the barrels, Fawkes still stood tall. Shackled but unbent, he was a soldier who had volunteered to light the match. And though he could not know it, the horror awaiting him would be far greater than the inferno he had planned. This was not yet the end, it was only the beginning. The night Guy Fawkes was dragged from the undercrofts of Westminster, London erupted in shock. Bells clanged, soldiers marched, and torches flickered through the streets as news spread like wildfire. A plot had been uncovered. Not just any plot, but a plan to obliterate king, court, and parliament in a single explosion. By dawn on November 5th, 1605, the entire city buzzed with rumor and dread. And at the center of it all was one man, Guy Fawkes. He was hauled first before King James I. The monarch, shrewd and suspicious, studied the soldier with a mixture of fascination and contempt. This was no trembling conspirator, no broken wretch begging for mercy. Even in irons, Fawkes carried himself with soldierly poise. Asked what he meant to do with the powder, he answered without hesitation, to blow the king and his court back to Scotland. Defiant words, too defiant. James ordered him sent to the Tower of London. There, amid the looming walls and shadowed chambers, the grim machinery of interrogation began. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a theater of suffering, a place where loyalty to the crown was extracted not with words but with screams. At first, they questioned him politely, hoping to learn the names of his fellow conspirators. Fawkes gave nothing. He insisted he acted alone, that no one else should suffer for the plot. His silence infuriated the council. Behind his composure, they saw not loyalty but insolence. If he would not speak, his body would be made to betray him. King James himself wrote instructions. Begin with gentler methods, then increase the torment until the prisoner broke. The rack, the iron manacles, the crushing weights all lay in readiness. The rack was the most feared. A wooden frame fitted with rollers at each end, it stretched the prisoner's limbs until joints cracked and muscles tore. Few endured it long without confessing, and fewer still ever walked properly again. Fawkes, however, endured. Day after day, he was dragged from his cell, shackled, stretched, and interrogated. His strong soldier's body, once hardened by campaigns in Flanders, was slowly dismantled. Muscles quivered, bones shifted, flesh tore, yet still he resisted. His voice rasped but gave no names. His hands, once steady enough to light a fuse, now trembled uncontrollably. The pressure mounted not just on his body, but on his mind. Interrogators reminded him that death would not be his escape. To be condemned as a traitor meant more than hanging. It meant being dragged through the streets, half strangled on the gallows, cut open alive. His entrails burned before his eyes, his body quartered, his head displayed to rot above the city gates. They described each detail with relish, a reminder that silence would not save him. And yet, for days, Fawkes endured. But every body has limits. After more than a week of torture, the soldier who had faced armies finally began to break. Exhausted, mangled, and nearly unrecognizable, he staggered under the weight of his agony. At last, on November 9th, he signed a confession. It is one of the most chilling relics of the gunpowder plot. The signature scrawled across the parchment is barely legible, a weak sprawl of lines instead of his usual bold hand. Where once he had written Guido Fawkes with a soldier's precision, now the letters are fractured, shaking, almost childlike. A name reduced to ruin. Through torture, the government got what it wanted. Fawkes named Robert Catesby as the leader and implicated the circle of Catholic gentlemen behind the plot. Many of them had already been hunted down and killed in skirmishes with the king's men. But now the crown had evidence to justify the spectacle to come. Still, there was something in Fawkes that even the rack could not extinguish. Though broken in body, he remained eerily calm in spirit. He admitted his guilt but refused to abase himself. To his interrogators' frustration, he spoke of his actions not as villainy, but as faith. He insisted he had acted for his religion, for the liberty of Catholics in England, and would have succeeded had Providence not betrayed him. This defiance, even in ruin, made him dangerous still. For while the rack had stolen his strength, it had not stolen his legend. Already whispers spread. Here was a man who had endured the king's tortures with silence, who had nearly brought down Parliament with his own hands. The government feared his death might turn him into a martyr unless it was staged with maximum horror. And so the sentence was fixed. Guy Fawkes and the surviving conspirators would not simply be executed. They would be destroyed, in public, in pieces, their bodies mutilated until they were not men, but warnings carved in flesh. By January of 1606, the smoke of the gunpowder plot had cleared, but the shadow of it still hung over England like a storm. The king lived, Parliament stood, but the fear remained. If one man and a handful of co-conspirators could nearly wipe out the realm's heart in a single blast, what else might be lurking in the dark? King James and his council knew the answer was not simply to punish, it was to perform. Justice would not be private, it would be theater. On January 27th, 1606, Westminster Hall became a stage. Its soaring timbered roof and cold stone walls had witnessed centuries of power, but never had they hosted such an audience. Nobles, bishops, courtiers, and commoners crammed into the chamber, their breath frosting in the winter air. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to lean in closer to hear the words spoken that day. At the center of the hall, behind a wooden barrier, stood the accused, 8 men who had conspired to turn Westminster into ash. Among them was Guy Fawkes, the soldier turned would-be saboteur, gaunt from weeks of torment in the Tower. His once proud frame sagged. His hands trembled from the rack's lingering agony. Yet there was still a trace of fire in his eyes, a glint that no chain could dim. The charges were read aloud with venomous clarity: treason against the crown, conspiracy to murder the king, queen, and royal family, to destroy the House of Lords, to incite rebellion, and to invite foreign invasion. It was not simply crime, it was apocalypse. For the prosecutors, every word was calculated. They did not merely accuse, they painted the conspirators as monsters, inhuman and hellish, agents of the Pope and of Satan himself. To kill a king was not just rebellion, they declared. It was the unraveling of God's order on earth. The accused listened in silence. They had little choice. The verdict had been decided long before the first word was spoken. In trials of treason, especially those that threatened the very monarchy, guilt was not questioned, only displayed. Fawkes, when finally given the chance to speak, admitted the intent but defended the cause. He said plainly that his only regret was failure, that the plot was aimed at the king and parliament, not the people of England, and that his purpose had been religious liberty. His words were recorded with a mixture of awe and horror. Here was no groveling man pleading for mercy, but a soldier confessing with pride. But pride availed him nothing. The Attorney General thundered back that such excuses were worse than the crime itself, for they clothed villainy in righteousness. He reminded the hall that had the barrels ignited, thousands, men, women, children, would have died in fire and rubble. The crowd hissed and muttered. In that charged moment, Guy Fawkes was not just a prisoner. He was the specter of what might have been, the living embodiment of the nation's near death. When the verdict was delivered, it fell like a hammer, guilty of high treason. But the word guilty was not the end. The sentence itself was a performance designed to terrify. One by one, the conspirators were condemned to the ancient punishment reserved for traitors: to be drawn upon a hurdle through the streets, hanged by the neck until half dead, then cut down alive, to have their genitals cut away, their entrails ripped out and burned before their eyes, their hearts torn from their chests, their heads severed, their bodies quartered, and each piece displayed to rot upon the gates of England. It was not simply death, it was annihilation. As the words echoed through Westminster Hall, some spectators shuddered, others cheered, and still others whispered prayers. For the conspirators, there was no illusion of mercy. This was not punishment to fit a crime. It was a ritual of terror designed to remind every Englishman what it meant to challenge the crown. Guy Fawkes bowed his head as the sentence was pronounced. Whether from weariness or acceptance, no one could say. Perhaps he already knew that his fate had been sealed the night they dragged him from the vaults beneath Parliament. Perhaps he was already dead in spirit, his body little more than a vessel awaiting destruction. But one thing was certain: his execution would be no quiet affair. It would be staged as a carnival of cruelty, a lesson written in blood and smoke. The people would gather, the children would cheer, and the traitors would be made into examples. When the court was dismissed, the 8 men were dragged back to their cells to await the final act. Outside, London bristled with anticipation. Rumors flew through the taverns and marketplaces. When would they die? Would the execution be swift or prolonged? How many pieces of their bodies would be nailed to the city gates? January 31st, 1606. A bitter winter morning settled over London, the air sharp with frost and the smell of wood smoke. Yet despite the cold, tens of thousands gathered outside Westminster. From the riverbanks to the rooftops, The city pressed in to watch. They had not come for a simple hanging. They had come for a ritual, the destruction of traitors. At Old Palace Yard, a great scaffold had been erected, timber rising stark against a gray sky. The gallows loomed above the throng, ropes swaying slightly in the chill wind. Beneath it stood the block, the knives, the brazier already lit to consume the traitor's entrails. The crowd jostled and murmured, eager for blood. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Merchants sold ale and pies. For the people of London, this was more than justice. It was theater. One by one, the conspirators of the gunpowder plot were dragged through the street on hurdles, their bodies bound flat to wooden frames and pulled by horses. Mud splashed, jeers rang out, stones were hurled. To be drawn was humiliation itself. The traitor displayed like carrion to the crowd before even reaching the gallows. First came Thomas Wintour, then Ambrose Rookwood, then others. Each man was half strangled on the rope, cut down still alive, and butchered before the crowd. Entrails burned, heads severed, quarters lifted high in triumph. The mob roared approval, half in horror, half in exhilaration. The message was unmistakable. This is the fate of those who dare to defy king and kingdom. At last, the final prisoner was brought forth. Guy Fawkes, the man who had crouched among barrels of powder, who had defied interrogators and endured the rack, was scarcely recognizable. His hair hung limp and matted. His frame, once hardened by years of soldiering, was broken, his steps faltering. Weeks of torture had left him so weak he could barely walk. Some accounts say he was helped to the scaffold by guards, his legs trembling under him. Yet even then, there was a strange composure in him. If the crowd expected pleas for mercy, they received none. If they expected tears, they saw only resolve. Fawkes climbed the wooden ladder toward the noose. Every movement labored, every breath ragged. The hangman waited, rope in hand. The ritual demanded that he suffer, that he hang until nearly dead, be cut down, revived for mutilation, and feel the knife open his belly while his entrails were burned before his eyes. But whether by accident, design, or final defiance, Guy Fawkes robbed the executioner of that satisfaction. As he mounted the ladder, he steadied himself for a moment. Then with one sudden motion, he leapt. The crowd gasped. His body fell with a crack, the noose snapping taut. His neck broke instantly. He hung lifeless, head slumped, before the executioner could cut him down. Some said it was cowardice, a desperate bid to escape the torment that awaited. Others whispered it was courage, the final act of a soldier who would not be butchered alive. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The ritual of agony was denied. Fawkes had beaten them to the end, but death did not spare him the final indignities. His body was cut down, lifeless but still condemned. The executioner severed his head, quartered his corpse, and held each piece aloft to the roar of the mob. Blood steamed in the cold air. The parts were carried away to be displayed on gates across the realm. London Bridge, York, and other strongholds of authority. His head, tarred against decay, leered down from its spike as merchants and nobles passed beneath. The crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with stories of what they had seen. Some laughed, some drank to the king's survival, others muttered that Fawkes had cheated the executioner, but all carried the memory, the gunpowder plotter, dragged, hanged, broken, and scattered. For King James and his ministers, the day had achieved its purpose. The people had witnessed not just justice, but terror. They had seen the flesh of treason destroyed piece by piece. They would remember it every November 5th, when bonfires roared and effigies burned. The execution was not only punishment, it was propaganda. And yet there lingered something dangerous in the tale. For though his body was broken, Guy Fawkes had died with a strange kind of defiance. He had refused to beg. He had refused to scream. And in that leap from the scaffold, he had seized his own death, denying the crown the theater had craved. The scaffold was cleared, the blood washed away. The gates of London sprouted new grim trophies, and the soldier who had almost turned England to ash was reduced to fragments. But fragments, as history would prove, can grow into legends. The blood had barely dried at Old Palace Yard when the legend of Guy Fawkes began to take root. His body was quartered, his head dipped in tar and fixed to a spike, his limbs nailed to gates across England. The government had sought to erase him, to scatter his memory as they scattered his flesh. Yet the opposite happened. Fawkes did not vanish. He multiplied. The very horror meant to silence his name gave it power. In the weeks after his execution, Londoners whispered stories of the man who had defied king and council, who had endured the rack in silence, who had robbed his executioners of their ritual by leaping to his death. For some, he was a villain, a fanatic who would have slaughtered thousands. For others, particularly among England's persecuted Catholics, he became a dark kind of hero, proof that resistance, however doomed, was possible. But above all, Guy Fawkes became useful to the state. King James and his ministers knew fear was a fragile weapon. The gunpowder plot had shaken England to its bones. To allow that fear to fade was to risk it returning. So Parliament moved swiftly. In January 1606, just days after the executions, they passed the Observance of 5th November Act. It decreed that every year on the anniversary of the plot, churches would hold services of thanksgiving for the king's deliverance. Bells would ring, prayers would be said, the people would remember, and in time memory turned ritual. On the first anniversary, bonfires blazed across London. Effigies were thrown upon the flames, sometimes of Guy Fawkes himself, sometimes of the Pope. Children ran through the streets with lanterns, shouting, "Remember, remember!" The act of rebellion had been transformed into a festival of loyalty. But beneath the surface, the ritual carried darker echoes. Burning effigies, watching flames consume a face, was not just celebration, it was reenactment. Every November 5th, the people relived the execution in fire and ash. For centuries, Guy Fawkes was remembered as a warning. Parents taught their children of the traitor who sought to burn the kingdom. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of Catholic conspiracy. Effigies stuffed with straw were hurled into flames as crowds cheered. The very name Guy became synonymous with a ragged effigy, a grotesque doll to be mocked and destroyed. By the 19th century, the word Guy slipped into everyday speech, meaning any oddly dressed fellow, and later, any man at all. From traitor to common slang, his legacy was everywhere, often unrecognized. And yet history has a cruel irony. The government had tried to make Guy Fawkes a symbol of terror defeated. Instead, he became a symbol of defiance remembered. Over the centuries, as England's politics shifted and religion's fires cooled, the meaning of November 5th evolved. The bonfires remained, but the hatred faded. By the Victorian era, the day was as much carnival as commemoration, a festival of fireworks and feasting. Children begged pennies for the Guy, parading their effigies through the streets. The ritual of burning turned from vengeance into celebration. But still at the heart of it was the memory of a man who nearly blew a kingdom apart. In the modern age, Guy Fawkes took on new faces. He became a figure in literature, in art, in protest. The mask that bore his stylized face, popularized by graphic novels and films, transformed him once more, from traitor into icon of rebellion, adopted by activists across the world. In marches, in online movements, in the swelling crowds of protest, the mask stared out, grinning, defiant, eternal. It is one of history's great ironies. The English state designed his execution to annihilate not only his body, but his idea. Yet the more they sought to erase him, the deeper he burned into memory. His screams, his broken body, his shattered signature on the confession, all of it became fuel for the fire of legend. And so, every November 5th, flames still roar into the night sky. Fireworks burst like echoes of the explosion that never was. Children laugh, families gather, effigies burn. Most scarcely remember the man behind it, the soldier tortured in the tower, the broken body on the scaffold. But the ritual endures, because horror endures. Guy Fawkes did not succeed in blowing up Parliament, but in a way he succeeded in something stranger. He ensured that kings, governments, and people alike would remember him, not for his life, but for his death. The execution of Guy Fawkes was meant to be the erasure of a man. Instead, it was his immortality. For in the fire that consumed him, something remained, an ember of defiance, glowing still in ash.